Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive into a stack of sources covering a deeply tragic event that unfolded recently in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, the shooting deaths of two young people outside a museum, it's just awful.
It really is. Our sources for this dive, they include reports from major news outlets like CBS, AP, Al Jazeera.
Right, and we've also got some legal information on homicide classifications in D.C., plus context on how embassies operate, the roles of staff members.
And our mission here really is to pull out the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from all these sources.
Exactly. We want to help you understand what happened, who was involved, the immediate aftermath.
And the wider context surrounding it all. Basically, a shortcut to getting informed on this complex story without getting totally overwhelmed.
Absolutely. So let's start by setting the scene based on what the sources tell us.
Okay.
This tragic event unfolded on Wednesday, May 21st, 2025. It was just after 9 p.m. The specific time noted is around 9:08 p.m.
And the location, that seems pretty significant, too. Outside the Capitol Jewish Museum?
Right in the heart of Washington, D.C.
And near an FBI field office, which is quite a detail.
It is, yeah. What happened was two people were shot and killed. They were leaving an event at the museum.
It's just leaving an event.
Yeah. When responding officers arrived, they found the victims with gunshot wounds. They were unconscious, not breathing.
God, that sounds incredibly fast, brutal. And the reports say an arrest was made very quickly, like right there.
Yes, that's correct. A suspect was taken into custody right there at the scene, almost immediately after the shooting.
Wow. Okay. Now, the sources we have, they really they dig into the lives that were cut short here.
They do. The victims were Yaron Lischinsky, he was 30, and Sarah Lynn Milgrim, she was 26.
And one of the most just heart-wrenching details that comes through in multiple sources.
Yeah.
They weren't just colleagues leaving an event together. They were a couple.
A couple. Deeply in love, apparently on the verge of getting engaged.
Oh, that's devastating. The Israeli ambassador, he shared that Yaron had actually bought a ring that week.
That very week.
Yeah.
With plans to propose to Sarah the next week.
Yeah.
In Jerusalem.
Wow. Just, they were described as, a beautiful couple, bright future ahead, just out for an evening.
It really puts a very human face on this.
Yeah.
So let's look at who they were, based on the sources. Sarah Lynn Milgrim. She was an American citizen.
Right, from Overland Park, Kansas. Her father mentioned she started working at the Israeli embassy in Washington back in November 2023.
And her background sounds, incredibly impressive. Multiple degrees.
Yeah, focused on international studies policy from KU American University.
And even the UN for Peace University.
Right. People who knew her, they described her as brilliant, always smiling, very purposeful.
A passion for Judaism, for Israel, driven by this desire to, quote, do some good.
And the reports also really highlight her commitment to peace-building interfaith dialogue. That seems core to who she was.
Definitely. Before the embassy job, she was involved with an organization in Tel Aviv. It focused on, tech training and conflict dialogue.
For young Palestinians and Israelis, that's significant.
Yeah, and she'd also gotten training from the U.S. Institute of Peace in religious engagement and peace building.
Her college roommate remembered her as an animal lover, passionate about the environment.
Tactful, cautious, a real peacemaker, and also stood proudly in her Judaism, happy to educate others about it.
That comes through. A Jewish community leader mentioned Sarah was a key contact for groups working with women's, LGBTQ, multi-faith communities.
And that small detail from her Instagram bio, the yellow ribbon for the hostages, and that Hebrew quote from Deuteronomy.
Justice. Justice you shall pursue. It really paints a picture.
It does. And then there's Yaron Lischinsky, an Israeli citizen.
Grew up partly in Germany, moved to Israel at 16, served in the military.
Right. And according to a veteran Israeli diplomat, he really dedicated his life to the state of Israel, the Zionist cause.
A former professor called him a mensch.
A mensch. A real human being. Kind, thoughtful, always smiling, embodying Judeo-Christian values. That's quite a description.
It is. And a friend from a Messianic Jewish congregation remembered him as a truth seeker, willing to serve others.
He had a master's in government, diplomacy, and strategy. And at the embassy, his job was research assistant.
Tracking events, trends in the Middle East, North Africa.
Exactly. And his LinkedIn profile, another detail pulled from the sources, mentioned he advocated for interfaith dialogue, intercultural understanding.
And was an ardent believer in deepening ties through the Abraham Accords.
Ah, yes, the Abraham Accords. Worth reminding folks, those are the agreements from 2020 that normalized relations between Israel and several Arab nations, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco.
So his work, his passions, they really aligned with building those connections.
Clearly. And like Sarah, his Instagram also had that yellow ribbon.
So they were leaving this reception for young diplomats, you said?
Yeah.
Yes. At the Capital Jewish Museum. Someone who was inside mentioned the event itself was focused on humanitarian aid, bringing people together from different backgrounds.
Which makes it all the more jarring, given who they were, what they were doing, that someone close to them stated they felt they weren't targeted for policy reasons.
But simply because they were Jews. That's a heavy statement reported in the sources.
It really is. Okay, let's shift focus now to the individual who was apprehended, the suspect.
Identified in the sources as Elias Rodriguez. He's 31, from Chicago, Illinois, currently in custody.
And there are details from witnesses, surveillance video.
Right.
What do they show?
Witnesses apparently saw him behaving suspiciously beforehand, like pacing outside the museum.
Okay.
And the surveillance footage reportedly shows him approach a group, open fire, and then specifically move closer to Yaron and Sarah after they fell.
Oh, God.
Yeah, the description in the source is chilling. He says he leaned over them, fired more shots, even appeared to reload before jogging off.
And then I know. He went inside the museum.
Reportedly, yes, and stated he did it.
And when taken into custody, the statements reported are pretty direct.
Very direct. Charging documents and law enforcement sources say he shouted, "Free Palestine," and told police, quote, "I did it. I did it for Gaza. Also, I did it for Palestine. I did it for Gaza. I am unarmed."
Wow. The sources also look into potential influences, right?
They do. Court documents mention he told detectives he admired that Air Force member who set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in February 2024.
Called him courageous, a martyr.
Yes. And investigators are also trying to authenticate some writing circulating online, supposedly by Rodriguez, titled "Escalate for Gaza, Bring the War Home."
Which contains accusations against Israel about Gaza.
Right. And his social media history, according to reports, showed posts about pro-Palestinian activism, frustration with media coverage of the war, inflammatory posts about Israel.
And discussion of violence for political gain. It's a lot.
It is. From the law enforcement side, while they haven't, officially confirmed a motive publicly, officials describe the attack as targeted. And it's being investigated on two main tracks: as a hate crime against the Jewish community and as an act of terrorism.
An FBI official explicitly called it an act of terror.
Yes, they did.
So, turning to the investigation itself and the charges, where do things stand now, according to the sources?
Okay, so the suspect, Rodriguez, he remains in custody. Authorities currently believe he acted alone.
And he hasn't entered a plea yet.
Not during the preliminary court appearance, no.
And the investigation seems quite extensive.
It does. An FBI affidavit noted he flew to D.C. from Chicago the day before the shooting.
With a handgun in his checked luggage.
Yes. And he bought a ticket for the museum event just about 3 hours before it started.
Was he known to law enforcement before this?
Reports say he wasn't previously on their radar. No. The investigation has also extended back to Chicago. Police searched his home there.
And the FBI is working with D.C. police, going through social media, seized electronic devices. Standard procedure in a case like this, but thorough.
Yeah.
Very thorough. Now, the charges announced by federal prosecutors, they are significant.
What are they specifically?
2 counts of first-degree murder. Also, murder of foreign officials.
Murder of foreign officials. That's specific.
It is. It's a federal charge that applies when a U.S. national murders a foreign official, guest, or internationally protected person within the U.S.
Okay, so that highlights the potential international aspect, even though they were embassy staff.
Exactly. Other charges include causing death through use of a firearm and discharge of a firearm during a crime of violence. All felonies.
And the potential penalties are severe.
Extremely. The murder charges carry potential penalties up to life in prison or, notably, the death sentence.
Even though D.C. itself doesn't have capital punishment, the federal charge carries that possibility.
Right. That's a key distinction in the sources. The minimum for first-degree murder in D.C. itself is 30 years. And prosecutors have indicated more charges might be coming.
Okay. And just on a public safety note,
the FBI Washington field office put out a statement on social media saying that, based on their investigation so far, they believe there's no ongoing threat to public safety related to this incident.
Right. Okay. Now, this is where things get really interesting, looking at how this event rippled outwards.
Absolutely. The reactions. Immediate global outrage, condemnation, from officials in the U.S., Israel, Europe.
And the reactions themselves, reported in the sources, they reveal some fascinating angles. Let's start with the U.S. officials.
Okay. President Trump condemned the killings, called them horrible, and explicitly said, based obviously on anti-Semitism.
Stating, hatred and radicalism have no place in the USA.
Right. Other officials like Attorney General Pam Bondi, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, they echo that, emphasizing full prosecution, combating anti-Semitism. The Homeland Security Secretary called the victims senselessly killed.
And the Israeli officials, their reaction was strong too.
Very strong. Prime Minister Netanyahu called it horrific anti-Semitic, a brutal terrorist attack. He mentioned instructing Israeli missions worldwide to increase security.
And he specifically linked the murders to, quote, the terrible price of anti-Semitism and the wild incitement against the state of Israel.
Yes, blaming critics of the war in Gaza and what he called the spread of lies. The Israeli foreign minister had a similar message, pointing to toxic anti-Semitic incitement, including from leaders in Europe.
Which is notable because European leaders also strongly condemned the attack.
They did. Leaders from Germany, the EU, UK, France, Ireland, Italy. Strong statements, many explicitly calling it anti-Semitic, an act of hatred or barbarity.
And the sources point out this includes some leaders who have recently been critical of Israel's actions in Gaza.
That context is definitely highlighted.
This incident also brings the nature of embassy work into focus, doesn't it? Our sources touch on that.
They do. Embassies are the headquarters for diplomacy, led by an ambassador, but they house representatives from various agencies, not just State Department. FBI, DHS are mentioned.
And they employ both American staff, like Foreign Service officers, and what are called locally engaged staff.
Right. And Sarah, an American citizen working at the Israeli embassy, and Yaron, an Israeli citizen working there, they fall into that broader embassy staff category. Maybe not credentialed diplomats in the classic sense, but vital parts of the mission.
And the sources make a really crucial point here about locally engaged staff.
Yeah, that these staff members who give their loyalty to a foreign government, particularly at high-threat posts, they have historically paid a high price, sometimes, tragically, with their lives.
It really underscores the inherent risks, even if you're not, a high-profile diplomat.
Exactly. Which brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the differing perspectives on motive that appear in some sources.
Right, that nuance.
One source includes commentary from a media studies professor. They note that, while the attack could be seen as straightforward anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Semitism.
It's also possible the suspect was acting out of frustration over the situation in Gaza, or Israeli policies specifically.
And this source suggests that distinguishing between those potential motives, it actually matters for how we understand and respond to such attacks.
So, stepping back, what does this all mean, this deep dive into the sources? It paints a picture of a deeply tragic event sitting right at the intersection of global conflict, individual action, and identity.
Precisely. The sources really present this incident through multiple lenses, don't they? You see it framed as a targeted hate crime against Jews. You see it framed as an act of terrorism linked to geopolitical conflict. And you see it as a personal tragedy, potentially stemming from frustration over specific policies.
And our role here, just to be clear, has been to lay out these different facets as they're reported in the sources we looked at. We're showing you the various interpretations, the evidence presented, not endorsing any one particular view ourselves.
Exactly. It also really puts a spotlight on the individuals, the people behind diplomatic missions, Yaron and Sarah, their backgrounds in peace building, interfaith dialogue, fostering relations.
They represent people dedicated to connecting cultures, building bridges, even when things are tense globally.
In their work, their passions, their deaths.
Yeah.
It underscores this awful reality that even those working towards understanding can become targets in ways that seem just fundamentally opposed to their own values.
Yeah. And finally, it's just a stark reminder, isn't it? How quickly, how tragically events happening far away can erupt into violence right here, impacting individuals who are just living their lives, doing their jobs.
You're really it.
This attack, tragically ending the lives of two young people who were dedicated to their work, to each other, to a future together. It leaves us with this complex picture, shaped by global conflict, by alleged motives rooted in both hate and perhaps frustration, and by these differing interpretations of the why.
It forces you to confront how international tensions can translate into such targeted, brutal violence, and the heavy, unpredictable price individuals can pay.
So what stands out to you from this deep dive? Maybe it's something to keep mulling over, thinking about those complex connections between what happens on the world stage and the safety of individuals, even in places you'd assume are secure.